Ezra chapter 5 and chapter 6. But like I say, we're going to look at here in the book of in Esther. But now let me mention that we're not going to have we're not going to go through and just reading too many passages, and I'll show you why in this. We have it laid out. I have it laid out, and we're going to kind of just go through and learn quite a few things in the book of Esther. Is the name of God mentioned in Esther at all? No. But we see God's hand in all of it. We see God's providence and God's sovereignty. And so we will look at that. But before we had, thank you, because it's hard to see with that. But before we had discussed about in this, in Ezra in chapter 5 and chapter 6, we talked about practicing what you preach. And that was with Haggai and Zechariah, how they both had aided in the work of the Lord. So they didn't just tell them and prophesy to them, but you read in chapter 5 and chapter 6 that they helped in the work. They continued on. And sadly, there are many that all they're going to do is stand up and they'll speak a word. And then a lot of times not even the words that they study or learn. And then that's it. They just don't even get involved in the work. But here, Haggai and Zechariah both aided in the work. We talked about it as well, pressing on though pressures rise. We looked at that as well. Why? Because then all of a sudden people began to question again, and they began to question the work of the rebuilding of the temple and what they were doing. And so Zerubbabel and Joshua, if you remember, Haggai and Zechariah had prophesied to them, encouraged them to press on in the Lord. Then they began to do the work again, and it seemed like it was deja vu. Because if you remember, they began to do the work before, and then people came along and made the government put a stop to it. But now this time, what happened? Well, people began to criticize and question. But they were kind of legitimately wondering about the work. Who gave you license to do this? This is years later. And what happens is Darius, in chapter 6, you read about that Darius actually, he finds a commandment from Cyrus, who basically said that they had license to go and to rebuild, but also they were able to furnish things in the work. So Darius actually ends up in the end helping them along. And so if they would have sat back and they would have been fearful and not done anything, then we see that they wouldn't have been blessed. But they pressed on. And so then we see at the end that they praised God. They were praising God for His providence and His provisions. And we're going to see this in the book of Esther. But that's what ends up happening, is that they basically have this big feast and celebration, and they're rejoicing because of God's providence. Because God had, once they stepped out in faith again and stepped out from that fear, we see God working in their hearts and lives. And by the way, again, it took Haggai, it took Zechariah, it took many ones to get them back on track. But let's look here in the book of Esther. Now, the timeline here. Now, what I want us to notice here, I have the title, I guess you could say, Sovereignty and Surrender. Sovereignty and Surrender. And I look here in Proverbs 16, verse 9. It says, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. So we can make plans. How many have made plans before and they've fallen completely through the cracks? So they've just, there's been a curveball every time. And so we may make plans, we may prepare, and it's not a bad thing to try to prepare, but God is the one that establishes, and we see God opens doors and He can shut doors. And God is the one that ultimately we need to keep our focus on, and His will. So that's where we're looking at sovereignty and surrender. And so again, is His name mentioned in Esther? No. But we see all throughout in the book of Esther. Of course, and if you read in Esther in chapter 1, in verse 1, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. There's speculation whether this is the same king that was there present with the battle of 300 Spartans. Okay, so, they made a big movie of that. Of course, it was a movie prior to that, back, I believe, in the 50s. But again, and that's where, you'd have ones, well, I'm Spartacus. So, I think that's the same. That may be a different film. But in this here, again, they made that film, and what they did was they made it out to where the Persians were just completely ridiculous, and they just conflated everything. So there's a lot of embellishment, and of course they do that with a lot of films. But there is questions of whether that was the same king of Persia at this time who was actually would have been on the throne, would have been ruling when they faced the 300 Spartans. So it is very interesting in this. But what happens is they're having a feast. It says in those days he sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes of provinces being before him. And when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when those days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Of course, what ends up happening, he's trying to show everything off in his kingdom. He is letting people know how grand and glorious it all is. And you know, I remember when we were in Northport, I added on another room to the house. I added on another room, did the wiring, put in the windows, and then I painted a big bear on the side of the wall. And I was so excited about that. And that was my bear room. That was the place where I can go and sit and just look at all the bear stuff. You know, I like bears, you know. Now, I don't really care to just meet one just, you know, out in the woods somewhere, but I like bears. But that's where I painted, and that was where, you know, and we'd have company come over. We'd have a lot of international students, and we were able to have an extra place where they were able to go and sit. It wasn't too much of anything, but they would go and they would say, man, you built this, you did this. And I'd just take them around and show them the area and the books and everything else. And, you know, you just have a look. You know, some of y'all know what I mean. You have an area and a place where you show and you're like, this is my collection. This is what I've got. This is my memorabilia. This is here. And boy, you just get excited about it. Did I show you this? Yeah, you already showed me. Let's see it again. All right. So the king has all of this stuff. He is trying to show everything off, his might, his power. Then there's one individual that he wanted to show off, and that was his wife. So he calls for her, Vashti. The thing is that she said, no, you're drunk, and I'm not going to. Okay? Well, that's a big no-no. You know, he is the king. And there's a lot of whispers going on. And of course, some of the advisors said, wait a minute. If you let your wife get away with it, she's way in this position and power, then all our wives are going to get away with it. And boy, we can't have that chaos. So, well, again, what they end up doing is they end up disposing her, getting rid of her. Well, you know, and he was angry. He was so mad. And guys, you ever done anything, made a decision in anger? Anybody honest? No, you've never done. Any ladies here say your husbands have made a decision in anger? There we go. That's better. We at least have some honesty. And I'm sure there's some men in here, if they were honest, they'd regret some of the decisions they made in anger. He got angry and he said, well, yeah, let's get rid of her. I'm done. She should have listened to me. Should have came when I called her. So later on he says, oh, I made a mistake. Well, again, they say, well, it's too late. You need to find you another wife. So we see here the timeline in this. We notice, we've talked about the rebuilding of Jerusalem, that it stopped in Ezra chapter 4, but then you also see Haggai and Zechariah, the prophecy. In about 520, and then 516, the temple is completed. This would be chapters 5 and 6, and this is where, in between here, is where you're going to have the story of Esther. So think about this again. As the work is going on, the work of the temple, the devil still is trying to find a way to dismantle and stop. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it with the persecution with the ones going to the temple. He did for a time. And he did have it where people got discouraged for a time. But God sent his men to go and revive them. And so the work continued. And the devil thought, well, I can't have that. So you got to come up with another way. So what way is this? Well, we'll look at that as well. And most of you know. But this is where in between that time period of what we see, what is taking place. And so it is interesting when you look at this and you notice the word Esther means star. Her name means star. Now that's a very befitting name. And that's what, and then Mordecai is a little different. There's different terms for his name. You have warrior, bitter, or bruising. Okay? But what that really is detailing here is this sense of strength through adversity. Now Mordecai would be one. I mean, he is one who's having to raise Esther. Esther is an orphan. And so Mordecai, who was her relative, believed it may have been her cousin, but he is our older cousin, but he's raising her and taking care of her. And so, again, Mordecai, when we see God uses him. And by the way, you know, we focus on, and we should focus on with Esther and how God used her. But Esther, again, you see somebody that's behind where Mordecai, behind the scenes in a way, where he has been very integral and faithful. God is using Mordecai to help lead her along, and again, to continue to be faithful and press on in encouraging her in following the Lord. And so we'll look at that as well. So the number one, what we see here is Esther's beautification. Now that what happens is they end up in chapter 2 beginning to pick out many beautiful women. But they need, now ladies, maybe it takes you a little less to get ready. They took a year to prepare for these women to meet the king. Now, I would imagine they had to take a year to get ready. So, but some husbands might feel like that, you know, that it's been about a year. But they spend 6 months lavishing them with oils and perfumes and everything else. They spend another 6 months makeup and everything else. They spend a long time with etiquette. How they're to approach the king, how they're to, speak to him, how they're to address him and be addressed, and also how they're to walk, how they're to act, every single little detail. And so, it is interesting here. One, we see out of all the women, we read about Esther as well. Esther is learning these things. And I look at it as when we go in Genesis and read about Joseph, in many places that Joseph was at, even when he was sold into slavery, God had favor on Joseph, and there were people that were over Joseph who were integral in the Egyptian system who had favor over him. They had favor in their eyes. And so when we think about Potiphar had favored Joseph. And God took care of Joseph, and Potiphar saw Joseph's faithfulness, but also we see his character. And then when Joseph was thrown in prison, the jailer that was over that, he also favored Joseph. And we see God was with Joseph in that. Well, the same here with Esther. The person who was over picking out the women and preparing them, all of this, that individual had favored Esther. And Esther trusts them and does what he tells her to do. She does to the T. And what we see about Esther's life is that she not only had the outward beauty, you read about that, but she also had this inward virtue. And so look with me in 1 Peter chapter 3. Notice what Peter says here in 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter in chapter 3. Peter writes on how he writes on husbands and how they are to act within the home, and also wants to submit themselves to one another. But he writes here in chapter 3, in verse 1, he says, and notice verse 1, wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they, without a word, may be won by the conduct of their wives, their lifestyle, the way they live, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine clothing, fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. We do see this here with Esther, and the way she conducts herself in her life. she not only is beautiful on the outside, but she has this inward beauty as well, this inward virtue. And of course, we notice what also takes place is not just simply with her beautification, but then, of course, we see that the king ends up picking her. But then we see Mordecai's revelation, that is in chapter 2. Well, what happened in chapter 2 as well? Well, there were individuals that were very angry towards the king, and they wanted to kill him. And Mordecai caught wind of this. So Mordecai says, well, I don't care, it's none of my business. No. Mordecai faithfully, but he hears the message of what's going to happen, and ones that are trying to scheme and kill the king, and he goes to Esther and he warns about it. He warns, he warns, or he has once warned the king actually about it. And so again, this happens. Now, did the king find out? The king didn't find out about the plot, but he doesn't know that it was Mordecai who actually brought it out. And so, by the way, Mordecai does this not to, stand in the limelight. He just does it because he believes it's the right thing to do. And by the way, here's the wonderful thing about it. Mordecai, in his character, he is also, if the king were to die, that's it. Esther would not be picked. But we see God working through this. So Mordecai was faithful, and we see his revelation here that he lets ones know, hey, the king, there's a scheme and a plot to try to kill the king. And then we notice as well, as we go on, not just simply his revelation, but then also Mordecai's dedication in chapter 3. Now you have the verse there, pride goes before destruction, Proverbs 16:18, and a haughty spirit before a fall. That is the life of Haman. In Esther, in chapter 3, it says in verse 1, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. By the way, mark that. Agagites came out of, it's believed, they came out of the Amalekites. So the king that Saul had captured, King Agag, it's believed that here, if Saul would have done what he was supposed to do and completely wiped out the Amalekites, you would not have had Haman. You wouldn't have had Haman. But Haman now has been placed in authority, in a position. And by the way, the devil is seeking to be at work in the midst of this. He is being a tool of the devil. He is now put in this authority and this political power. And it says here, they advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, and for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. So, Mordecai, we see his dedication in this. Everyone else, he is not dissuaded by the crowd. He is not persuaded here. They're not, again, everybody else is bowing down to Haman and having this reverence. Mordecai is not doing that. And so notice in verse 3, then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? And now it happened when they spoke to him daily and he would not listen to them, and they told it to Haman. Over and over, by the way. Everyone, Haman's coming along. Haman goes out. And, everyone, here is Haman, one of the kings, one of the high-ranking officials. And everyone bows down, and then what does Mordecai do? Can you imagine that for Haman? He's sticking his neck up high, but then he looks and he sees everybody else is down, but Mordecai is standing right there, and he doesn't care. And over they keep saying, you gotta bow down, you gotta worship him, you gotta pay your respects. And he doesn't do it. He doesn't do it. So again, we see the dedication also of Mordecai. And when Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, now he's really angry. And that's when Haman tries to scheme and plot. It says in verse 6, he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So this is what's taking place. And we see in the midst of this, there is so much that is going on. And this is why I want us to we're not taking a break from Nehemiah and Ezra, but we're seeing with the timeline of what's going on. And so the temple has been rebuilt, but now we're seeing that in the midst of this, there's this conflict still that is not seen by everybody. We also see, as well as we go on, we see Esther's submission. And that is found in chapter 4. Because it is known now that what happens? Haman comes up with a scheme to kill the Jews in the land. And basically he makes it sound like, hey, there's a lot of really bad people, king. They hate your guts. And they're just terrible individuals. And why don't we just go ahead and just kill them? It's just, just take care of it. And the king's like, okay, yeah, take care of it. If you've got people that hate his guts, and, not too many, and again, he just frames it in a way that it's not that huge of a thing, but it's massive. It's massive. But the king says, okay. And he goes ahead and lets Haman, have that decision and authority. So then word gets out that the Israelites, the Jews, are going to be killed. And Mordecai knows this. It says in verse 3, or in chapter 4 and verse 1, when Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. And he went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, wailing, and many that lay in sackcloth and ashes. And again, the Persian system of communication was very rapid, very quick as well. So here, everyone is weeping and mourning. But Mordecai goes to Esther. Now, he sends a messenger to Esther. And we notice this here in verse 7. Esther sends for Mordecai, wondering why he is in the state he is. And Mordecai in verse 7 told the messenger, all that happened, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given to Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, that he might command her to go to the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. He knows that Esther is there for that purpose and time. And he's telling the messenger, let her know what is going to happen, and she has to go to the king. So he returns word. Esther then sends back this in verse 10. She spoke to Hathach, and he gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that anyone, any man or woman, who goes in the inner court to the king, but if they are not summoned, they could be put to death. They could die. So she says, and the reality is that I've not been summoned, and if I go, it almost seems like certain death. And notice in verse 13, Mordecai sends back. Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. You can try to hide, but it's not going to happen. And he says here, for if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Now that's very interesting, because if you remember with Moses and the children of Israel turning their backs against God, and what did God tell Moses? God told Moses, guess what? I'll just wipe them out and I'll start a whole nother nation. Oh no! God can do it. He can do it. God doesn't need you and me. You know that? You know that? God is, guess what? Sovereign. He's almighty. And here Mordecai is telling Esther, you have a call and a duty to go. But if you don't, guess what? God's still in control. And God's promises stand sure, and He will still deliver. He'll use somebody else to do it. Now that is, we see the faith of Mordecai in this. And he goes on to say, notice, he says, if you remain silent, he says, there will be another one to arise to deliver. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? He says, how do you not know, Esther, if this is all The providence of God. God working in all of this for now, this moment, this opportunity, this time. Are you really going to throw it away? And then we notice this in verse 15. Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or a day. My maids and I will fast likewise." Now that's a good thing here. Esther, before she did anything, she says, we're going to fast. We are going to seek the Lord, and would you pray for me and fast? And then notice this in the latter part of verse 16. "And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I" what? Perish. If I perish, I perish. We all need to come to that moment. The Christian has to come to that moment. To live the true Christian life. What did Jesus say before the cross? He said, "Not my will, but thine be done." Now his prayer in that, if there was any way to let this cup pass, but the reality, he says, it's not my will, but it's thine be done. And right here at this moment is Esther basically saying, it's not my will anymore. It's his be done. And if I perish, if I die, then so be it. Now, a lot of people don't like that. They don't want to, again, that's not the cute, type of religion that we speak of and we talk about in the theology that we put in a box. But to actually get to the place in your life where you say, you know what? If it works out, great. And if it doesn't, I'm still going to serve the Lord. I'm still going to press on. And if I perish, I perish. But she gets to that place. And so Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So we see this here. We see Esther's submission, her surrender. Even in the midst of the danger, she finally comes to this complete surrender in that. And then Esther gives an invitation to Haman. Haman, he's got it all, by the way. He's preparing gallows to kill Mordecai. He knows the Jews are going to get killed. And now the queen, because he has no clue she's a Jew. And now the queen, if you're Haman, you're on cloud 9. And the queen now has invited you to a special banquet. Oh, he's so thrilled. So thrilled. So what happens? Well, we see what ends up happening as well in chapter 6. And again, I know this is much just overview. But I want us to go through here just this evening and looking in Esther. But Mordecai, what happens is the king has a dream. And he's awakened and he can't sleep and he begins to look in these record books. He finds that there's a statement that talks about Mordecai actually being the one who had saved the king's life. Now again, that's of the Lord, that the king is tossing back and forth. He can't sleep. Then it ends up where in the end he finds this record where he realizes, he learns about that Mordecai is the one who saved him, who found the scheme and then told others about it. So what does the king do? The king says, you know what? We need to honor Mordecai. And so he sends for Haman. Again, when we talk about irony, right? Haman, this big irony. Haman that hates Mordecai, he's already preparing these gallows for Mordecai to be hung on. And the king says, hey, Haman, you know Mordecai? Oh, yes, I do. I want you to go and I want you to ride him around the city and I want you to celebrate him. What? And that's what he has to do. The most humiliating thing in life here is that, he now is parading Mordecai around the city. And people they are honoring Mordecai. They're honoring Mordecai. And if that's not enough, then in the end, Haman says, well, I still got that dinner invitation. I still got the dinner invitation from the queen. That should go well. Well, it doesn't. Doesn't go well. He finds out that she is a Jew. And he is begging for his life. The king, though, ends up having him killed. So what we see is we see here Mordecai's exaltation in chapter 6, but then in chapters 6 through 7, you can read about Haman's humiliation and in the end, his execution by the very gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, he ends up being killed. And then we see Israel's protection as well. Why? Because the only thing they could do was send news to ones, hey, on that day that you are going to die, you defend yourself. Fight off those who are trying to kill you. And they do. They prevail. And we see this protection, and there in the end we see Israel's celebration. What is that celebration? The Feast of Purim. This wonderful celebration of God's providence and sovereignty. How God worked through Esther and Mordecai in this. All that's taken place while the temple was being built, or after that, around that time later. By the way, there is another large nation that has just been established. Their government has just been established. What nation is that? Starts with an R. Rome. Rome. Is Rome going to be integral at all? You better believe it. Rome lasts for 1,000 years. So this is happening all in this time. What we see in all of it is the fact that God is sovereign. He is almighty. And I say this because we look at the news and we see all the things going on. We stand on His word and we stand on the truth. He knows the end from the beginning. And we just simply need to, in life, come to that place where we say, you know what? I'm going to follow Him, and if I perish, I perish. Because it's just all, He has it all in control. He has it all in control. And we see that here. They're rejoicing and they're praising the Lord. And there they begin to celebrate that feast of Purim as well. This time of God caring for His people and providing for them. But let's pray this evening.